Good morning. Thank you very much, program directors, for that wonderful introduction. I think I have a very difficult task following on the previous presenters that have set the bar very high. So I hope you'll be kind to me, particularly considering I come from government, which sometimes is already a barrier to communication. However, my presence here today is really an affirmation that we're in this together. There's no them, there's no us, we're all here together. Can we shout out to that? I would like to acknowledge all our elders and seniors and leaders who are in the audience, so all protocol observed in the interest of time. Like I said, I really would like to thank the conference organizers for inviting the department to participate here today, and in particular to sit on this esteemed panel. It's important for me to indicate at the outset that, as South Africans, I feel we are very, very harsh in our criticism of ourselves. We set very high standards for what we expect, and rightfully so. But in doing that, sometimes we don't acknowledge the good that we have done and the assets that are within our nation. So coming from the Department of Basic Education, for example, we have had to deal with a whole lot of social ills, and through that we have had to develop frameworks and guidelines and programs to not only focus on the curriculum, but to also look at what we call the care and support needs of children. And when we engage with our counterparts in the region, on the continent, but in particular, may I say, internationally, they are amazed that we have all these structures and policies and programs and support, as we've heard over the past day and a bit. And so those are things that we really, really must celebrate and acknowledge. But as we do that, we also work hard in making sure that we improve on them. I stand here today, and that's why I wanted to start with the acknowledgements, really to present the work of others. But more importantly, I think for me, the thoughts, experiences, and insights that come from a huge collective of our officials, of our partners, of our supporters that are at the coalface of this very, very important work. So as I start, I want to say shout out to the over 400,000 educators that are there supporting our children every single school day. Shout out to them, ayeye. Can we send a shout out to the Department of Basic Education officials who keep pushing against very stiff, hard, barriers to make sure that the care and support work is recognized as being integral and as being a priority in the sector. Shout out to them. Shout out to all the child and youth care workers that are there every day, 24/7, to really make sure that our children are cared for when we're failing them. Yes, a shout out to you. And shout out to our learner support agents. Are you in the room? You are my heart, because through you, we can begin to do this important work. This morning, as I was preparing to come here, I saw a clip on ENCA, and they were talking to an organization in the Western Cape about Mandela Day and the plans that they have for Mandela Day this year. And they were talking about a learning enrich program that they have set up and have developed support kits or they're calling care kits for schools. And it began to really, also strike me that there are many of us who are really aware that in our schools, there are a lot of challenges that our teachers face. Just yesterday, there was another research study that was published that once again, said that teachers say they are battling because they are not only battling with what is happening in their communities, the challenges that the children face and they have to face up to and acknowledge, but they themselves have their own hurts. They themselves, they have their own unresolved issues. And so they need the self-awareness, right? To be able to see that, to identify for themselves what their triggers are, and the responses that they then automatically go into. That may not necessarily be in the best interest of the children, but also of the learning and teaching process. And so I'm asking that before we also, as South Africans, once again say the education system is failing, can we at the outset start by making sure that we understand and we listen and we see and we recognize where people are at, and then begin to hold hands with them as we move forward. But as they gain their own agency, as I heard yesterday and I learned, you step out of the way and let them move on, because very often you then become the barrier, isn't it, of the progress that needs to be made. Is this way? Now, this is what our founding president said. And he set up the Nelson Mandela Foundation to really also remind us, and it lives on, to know that this is what we owe to our nation. The policy mandate for why care support is important in the basic education is wide. And I'm not going to go into each one of them, but I put it out there so that you are aware of it and that the slides can also be made available to people moving on from today. The Constitution obviously is out there as our founding document, but also what we have really tried to do is to institutionalize some of this work within the seminal documents of the Department of Basic Education, so that we provide a policy framework to make it sure that it is possible that care and support work can be integrated into the planning, the resourcing, and the business of teaching and learning. It's important, I think, for us just briefly to talk about where are we now. I think once again we have to acknowledge that we are fortunate in that we have universal access to primary education, which doesn't exist everywhere. So what that means is that we have in our schools, usually in most instances, safe spaces, our children 5 days a week for 12 to 13 years of their most important, life, where they are ready and are able to assimilate the knowledge and the skills to be able to have lifelong positive and health-promoting behaviors. And it is a space that we need not forget and not use optimally. The other issues are right out there in front of you. And I learned from yesterday that it's also important to now again, go back and remind us of what it is that we're talking about. Because very often, when you talk about our children, we focus on that which they do not have. And what then you do is in your actions and your practice, you lift that to be the most important thing. And they will give you what you focus on. So if you focus on the negative that they do, guess what? But look at those faces. These are the faces that we need to remember when we do our work. They're a bit mischievous, but that's what they're meant to be, right? Against those successes, I think we also recognize at the department that we also have some challenges that we face. That we have very many children, in particular learners with special needs, that are not within schooling. or education institutions. And our president reminded us in the SONA this year that we have about 500,000 that are out there that we need to find and we need to support. The levels of orphanhood are really still high in our country, but also the very high levels of violence and abuse, in particular sexual abuse, are really, really pressing problems. We acknowledge as a sector that we have a challenge with respect to the quality of basic education and something that we're working on. But we cannot do that without focusing on the learning environment, but also on the people. And that is our educators, that is our learners, that is our officials, and that's our parents. We have the Care and Support for Teaching and Learning framework. Many of you will have seen this slide. That really guides us in terms of the care and support programs in the department. And what it says is that we need to be the lead in dealing with school-level barriers, but really that our focus has to be on the child at the center, and that all of us around have to focus on her and him so that they thrive and learn better. And what we do is we use the ecological systems theoretical framework to identify both the risk factors but also the protective factors that exist within the child themselves, within their close environment, but also largely within the community and the country as a large, to make sure that we support them. And through that, we've identified 10 priority areas for care and support within education, and we say a school is not fit if it is not providing access to each one of those 10 priority areas, and psychosocial support is a key one and is mentioned in there. I am so very pleased that Commissioner Makwatlia is here in the room, because when I put this presentation together, I really was not aware, ma'am, that you are going to be here. But because there's such a close link between child and youth care work, and in particular mental health, I thought it's important for us to pause for a moment and recognize a tragedy that happened in our country of life as it remained in Gauteng. And following that, the South African Human Rights Commission actually had an inquiry that looked at what exactly happened and what are the causes, the root causes that made it possible for such to happen in our democratic era, where our rights are so clearly defined in our Constitution. There's the definition of mental health. I think many of you are familiar with it, but it's really just that the very fact that it is not only the absence of illness and disease, but making sure that the human and the child, each person, is whole and supported and can thrive in their totality. Briefly, I wanted to really put some of the pertinent findings that I think are of interest and of importance for this audience here. That the Human Rights Commission found that there is a considerable underinvestment in mental health in our country, and I think, as the previous speaker has said, even in child and youth care work. So it is our responsibility, and we shall go back and make sure that the Deputy Minister, as she promised yesterday, does her bit, and I have the responsibility and other education officials to make sure that these things are advocated for and that we see them through. It's also issues of coordination or lack thereof between the various sectors that are important. But I want to propose that you as change agents have the ability and the potential to connect us when we don't. Because it's because of you, Zeni, that I'm here. And we had social development yesterday. I don't know how many other forums like this have had education address and have a prominent role, because I think generally our default position is to go to social development and think that those are the only real players. And we're saying, we're here. We have a responsibility and a duty. Use us, and where we fail, to connect, assist us to connect with the others that are necessary. We know that the challenges in rural areas are huge. We know that issues of stigma and discrimination are really large, and also in the school setting. It's not only out there in communities, it's also in the schools. where some of this risk and discrimination can be concentrated in that space that's supposed to be nurturing and safe. And finally, we know that the services, in particular for children and adolescents, are neglected, and as a result, huge human rights violations have happened and continue to be happening and place children at major risk. And so all of us here must be aware of these things, because then the question is, now that we know, how are we going to do? And what are we going to do about it moving forward? Now, as an education system, we are judged on these criteria: that every child is enrolled at school at an appropriate age for each grade, that they attend school regularly and complete schooling, and that we provide them an opportunity to reach their full potential. But an individual educator, an individual school, an individual official is not recognized by the level of care that they provide, the sense of belonging that they engender within the spaces. What about respect, dignity, or not autonomy? And the recognition and use of community assets that are out there. This is like the work of women in society, unrecognized, unrewarded, not paid for, but it's really what matters, isn't it? And so, once again, my business is, how do we make sure that some of those indicators become that against which our performance as a sector is measured? This is a very nice slide for me. It was here in KZN. And really for me, it's saying that this is how our schools should make our children look every single day, and not only on various occasions when we have events happening, because our schools are meant to be caring and supporting spaces. In the 1 minute, I wanted to flag for you some of the successes that we've had in terms of the support and the implementation of this work within the education system. I think more importantly, I want to focus on the last bullet there, that whilst it is good for us to care and provide for learners, and that it's important for us to train our educators and support structures, I think it's important for us to begin to gather evidence of that which matters to the department in terms of academic performance. And we have now, Zeni, haven't we, put that work together to look at our children and how they've behaved and how they've performed, against the higher quintile schools, and in particular, because we know that the children that we're talking about are vulnerable learners. And it's begun to come to the fore that actually the work that we are doing, that we know is ethical, is important, it is deserving, it is constitutional, we know that is also assisting us to achieve the academic results that we are so yearning for. And in my engagement with teachers, I always remind them, and I remind our officials that it's also in the best interest of our results that we better take care of the children and not only focus on the texts and the desks and the curriculum. This is self-evident. What are some of the considerations that I'd like all of us to think about as we take our work forward? We believe really that it is important that we care for you and we take care of the carer, because you cannot give that which you don't have. When we file, they say, put on your mask first before assisting the others. We feel it's important for us to really also look again, like the previous speaker said, at the supervisions, at the support and the mentorship that exists to support our learner support agents, but also child and youth care workers that work within our schooling space. We believe that it is important that you work in sync with the program of the school and not in competition thereto. We believe that it's also very important for us to learn from one another. So there's some good work that is happening with the learner support agents that the department places in school. But this profession also provides us an opportunity to learn. And so once again, we don't compete, we learn from one another and we complement our work in terms of aligning and making sure that, once again, it's in the best interest of the child. And lastly, I want to mention that through this engagement and others, it will assist all of us, and in particular for government, to begin to put our tax money, isn't it, into programs such as this that are really making a difference in the lives of our children. These are some of our colleagues from the National Department of Basic Education that work on care and support. They never get seen outside of my building, and I thought it is important for you to see some of the faces that are committed and are pushing and are working with me and are giving me the motivation and many others of us to continue to do this. The President challenged us as a basic education sector that care and support is not outside of the work that we need to be doing. So I remind the education officials in the room, but I remind you that want to work with us, that this is what we need to focus on also as we move forward. So in conclusion, I really do want to say that we are trying our best and are advocating to have a different cadre of staff to be a permanent feature in the schooling system. This proposal I made at the Lekgotla with our new minister and deputy minister. Minister reminded us that she's come back, but she's actually new. So she has a new mandate and a new administration. That we have to critically look at our structures so that we integrate the care and support programming within our structure so that they can be planning, they can be resourcing, and it can become the business of the education system and not only a nice to have and an edit that comes from outside. Because this business unusual that we are called upon to do cannot only focus on desks and tasks and buildings, but it might also focus on the people, the educators, the learners, and also the officials and the parents and everybody else. So that when you, as an educator, say, or in response to, what do? You don't say, I teach mathematics, but you start by saying, I teach children the subject of mathematics, because your first focus has to be the child that's sitting in front of you. And look them in the eye and see them and support them, but once again, when they have their voice and agency, step away, let them move on. Thank you very much.